you here. So we're going to begin. Welcome all. It's so wonderful to have you here with us tonight. My name is Liz Visa. I am president of Friends of the Public Garden, and I'm the steering committee of Boston Park Advocates. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for our Mayoral Forum. We are thrilled that 322 of you who use and love Boston's green spaces have registered to participate tonight. I'm also happy to let everybody know that the forum is live streaming to the Boston Park Advocates Facebook page for more viewers to be able to tune in. So let everybody that you know that might not be able to get to the Zoom room, that Facebook is available to them. Before we start, I want to thank all of you who supported this effort by contributing funds, by helping with organization, by sharing data and signing on as community partners. Our appreciation also goes out to the Boston Parks Department. There are over 200 staff, care for over 2,000 acres of public parkland all year long. We all realize how critical these spaces were to our health and well-being during this challenging pandemic year. They were lifesavers to us all. For those of you new to Boston Park Advocates, we are a network of park-connected groups from across the city. For the past decade, we have organized and advocated on behalf of Boston's green space. You can be part of the network and sign up for our newsletters at bostonparkadvocates.org. You saw on the slideshow just now and can read on our website the 26 contributors and more than 100 park, garden, neighborhood, youth, arts, health, sports, religious, and community organizations who have joined us to say that parks matter in Boston. You can also read the mayoral candidates' responses to our park questionnaire on the website. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, WBZ TV and CBSN news anchor, Anaritas Rodriguez. We are so happy to have you with us, Anaritas. So with that, I'm going to have you take it away.
Thank you so much, Liz, and welcome to everyone who is watching us through this forum. I am so happy to be with you here celebrating and focusing on our parks, our community gardens, our schoolyards, urban wilds, our beaches, and our outdoor facilities tonight. One of my many favorite things as a news anchor and journalist is when we have good news to stories taking place in one of our parks, whether it be the Boston Pops on the Esplanade, Juneteenth in Franklin Park, Shakespeare on the Common, or goats eating invasive plants in Dorchester Park. All of these stories bring smiles to our faces and also to the people watching at home. We want to thank so much to the 4 candidates who are starting the forum with us tonight. We know how busy your schedules are this election season. Chief John Barrows, Councillor Andrea Campbell, Councillor Anissa Asaibi-George, and Councillor Michelle Wu are here with us to get started. Representative John Santiago will join us in about 30 minutes. Mayor Kim Janey has been invited but is not able to join us tonight. Tonight's questions were prepared by the Boston Park Advocates Steering Committee with input from many community partners. And the goal was to identify common issues and needs that relate to parks and open spaces across the city. We'll start in alphabetical order and rotate the order with each question. Candidates, you will be able to mute and unmute yourself throughout the forum. You'll see a timer box on your screen counting down the time remaining for each candidate. 10 seconds after the time runs out, candidates will be muted. 6 questions are 60-second answers, 4 questions are 90-second answers, and for the longer answers, the 60-second timer will go on for an additional 30 seconds. So with that said, let's get started because we have a lot to cover in our time together. Our first question is on park use. Candidates, you get 90 seconds each. Boston is home to the oldest park in the country, and much of Boston's park system was designed nearly 150 years ago. Today, residents have many different ways they use the parks, and we've had recent examples of conflicts between user groups and parks. What changes would you make to keep pace with the way people want to use parks in the 21st century? And what measures would you implement to balance competing interests among today's park users? Mr. Barrows, you are up first.
Thank you very much, and thank you for facilitating this conversation. I want to thank the Boston Park Advocates, all of the partners that have not only come together to put together this forum, but to take care of our parks around, year round, and to make sure that, in fact, our parks have the best and that they're being used. There are conflicts sometimes in our parks, and in many ways, there are parks throughout Boston that have high demand. And I've heard complaints from residents that they either can't access them, or sometimes there's confusion and people find themselves on the parks at the same time with different uses. We do need to have a more transparent online way so that even if you think you pulled a permit and you can be using the park, that you might see that there's a conflict online and that you actually didn't or aren't scheduled to use that park at that time. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is to make sure that the process to be able to book the park is a little easier. And as mayor, I'd make sure that both things happen.
You still have an additional 30 seconds, Mr. Barrows. Would you like to use it?
Okay, that clock is confusing. I thought I had more, but it went down to 0. So thanks for making that clear. So I would like to use it. There's far more to say. The important thing to start with, in fact, is to create more green space, more outdoor park space. I started by saying there's a lot of demand for our parks, and making sure that we know how to get permits and use them is one, but creating more outdoor space that people can use is really the answer to make sure that we can meet all of the demands of all of our residents in the city of Boston.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Barrows. We'll get the timer fixed, but this
confusing.
First question, 90 seconds. I'll remind you every time every question comes up. Councillor Campbell, you are up next. You have 90 seconds.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting, of course, this evening, and thank you to everyone in attendance, and of course the Boston Park advocates for creating the space for us to talk about these critical issues. Yeah, sometimes there are conflicts. Some people want their dogs in the park. Some people do not. Some people want their bikes in the park. Some people do not want bikes in their park. And some people want it to just be pedestrian friendly. No cars coming through at all. So I think we've seen those conflicts. And of course, right now, there are a lot of conversations around dirt bikes. One, it starts with engagement. And I don't always think the city of Boston does a great job of that. So I've always led the way as a district councilor for District 4, which is largely Dorchester, Mattapan, JP, and Rosendale, to make sure that when I'm engaging my residents, that means all of my residents, those in the civic associations, our civic leaders, our advocacy groups, but also residents and the lay and average person who don't attend the meetings, our young people. And when you continue that engagement and do it well, then you should have a sense of what the needs are and what the uses are, and then respond appropriately. So for example, we are getting requests right now for more parks for dogs specifically, which is a good thing. We're getting more parks and more emails and calls and text messages from youth who want to create space where they can use their bikes, who want to create space for just them, to play music maybe, between reasonable hours, of course. So I think when we do engagement well, we have a greater sense of what the needs are. We in the city of Boston can appropriately respond, expand access to green space, invest in better maintenance, and then of course, make everyone aware of what our goals are and do it as a collective.
Councillor Campbell, thank you so much. As you can see, our timer runs in 60-second increments.
I have to give Barrows credit for that. Thank you.
You did great. You were right on time. When you see the second 60-second increment go down to 30 on a 90-second answer, that's when you know your time is up. But as we mentioned, if it passes the time, the host will mute the candidate. Councillor Isaibi George, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that clarity as we demonstrate that we can walk, chew gum, and participate, maybe not speak, in our 43rd forum of this campaign season to date. And just grateful to be with all of you and to talk about the important role that our open space plays, both when we think about active space and passive space across our great city of Boston. And when we think about the multitude of uses that our park space provides, whether it is for those with dog owners looking for a safe place for their dogs to either run or play with other puppies and dogs, or whether it's active space that is permitted and structured for youth programming, which I think should be a priority here in the city of Boston, and then programmed for adult events across the city, but also making sure that we've got active space that is well maintained in every part of our city, and certainly able to be engaged and used in a multitude of ways. I think that our parks also offer such an incredible opportunity to attract visitors to our city. And when we talk about the public garden, when we talk about the Boston Common, for sure, those are one of the first and early places that we think about our parks and our open space. But it also includes Franklin Park as a park, also the Franklin Park Golf Course as an active environment, but also in the many parklets across our city. Our residents and those visiting our city should have opportunities to engage in lots of different ways.
Councillor Asaibi-George, thank you so much. Councillor Wu is up next. I see that she is logged on and is unmuting herself as we speak. You are on the move, Councillor Wu, and you have the virtual floor. Take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm staying off video while I'm in the car. We are just about 3 minutes away from home, so rushing back to be in a stable place. Thank you so much. I didn't want to miss a minute of this forum, and so I did want to tune in just to share my gratitude for your leadership day in, day out, and especially in a time when the parks really became they have always been our lungs of the city, but became the lifesavers of so many during the pandemic as well. I share often that my family doesn't have a summer home, and so the Boston parks and open spaces for my family and so many across the city are our summer home. But as we've seen throughout the pandemic, there also are winter, fall, and spring home. And we need to make sure that there's an integrated plan citywide across all the different uses to really match what residents need. This starts with the city of Boston being very proactive about the resources, the staffing, and the funding that's available. We are very aware that many of our parks are underutilized because of lighting that is inadequate, and so it doesn't feel safe there, or equipment or nets perhaps that need to be replaced. We're also aware that in the passive use parks, whether it's urban wilds or other spaces, sometimes the ownership structure of which department, between the Conservation Commission and the Parks Department, and where the funding to maintain that comes from, that the city of Boston needs to break down silos across our communities and neighborhoods. So there's a feeling of seamlessness between the options available and all the incredible open spaces across our city, and also within how we service these parks from city government and do the outreach to engage people in the process of imagining and creating what's possible for our city.
Councillor Wu, thank you so much. Question number 2 is on park programming. Candidates, you have 60 seconds each. So once the timer runs out, that's it. Programs increase park access, use, and public health, yet are often not equitably distributed across neighborhoods, nor reflect the diversity of our city. How would you identify disparities, and what strategies would you use to increase access to high-quality programming in all neighborhoods? Councillor Campbell, you're up first.
Thank you for this question, and this is near and dear. So I'm currently the District 4 councillor representing largely Dorchester, Mattapan, where I live with my beautiful husband and 2 beautiful boys, a little bit of Jamaica Plain and Rosendale. This is the district that has often experienced those very inequities. A lack of access to green space, open space. Some neighborhoods have park deserts, lack of the programming, lack of funding for continued maintenance of our parks. And many parks don't even have a Friends of the Park group and have been fighting to have such groups created. So as a district councilor, I've fought for equity for more access and greater funding. That wouldn't change if blessed to become the next elected mayor in the city of Boston. One, it requires doing a citywide audit. There is a lot of data already available, but I think we can do more. And then responding with our budget and with appropriate funding. And responding also with the infrastructure, the human capital, on all of the needs the residents would need to be able to maintain their spaces. They want to be empowered in this process as well.
Councillor Campbell, thank you. Councillor Asaibi-George.
Thanks for that question. I think it's so important that when we take a look at our parks and access to the parks, that we are looking at all of our parks and green spaces across the entire city to ensure that we are approaching access and opportunity and availability of those parks with an equity lens, and that we are fulfilling the promise of all of our residents being within 10 minutes of a park. We have to be very intentional about the investments that boost accessibility for all, and that we're also looking both at geography and the racial element of access to our parks, that all communities, especially our communities of color, have access to that 10-minute promise that we've made, but that we're also looking at accessibility from a disability or a differently abled perspective, that our residents of varying abilities have access to those parks. Over the last couple of years, I've started conversations and the ball rolling, no pun intended, to build a miracle field here in the city of Boston. I want to make this happen, and I will as mayor of this city.
Councilor Ivy-George, thank you. Councilwoman Wu.
Looks like we
may
might
have lost contact with her. So Mr. Barrows, if you could please take the floor, we'll see if she'll connect with us in a little bit.
Thank you very much. You know, I spent 13 years as the executive director of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, and parks was at the core of how we wanted to rebuild our neighborhood and make it a quality neighborhood for all of our residents. But when you sit down and you start to plan how the park is going to be used, you know, it's really about those who are in the room, those who are participating. And so sometimes those who haven't been participating get left out. And it's really important that we do a lot of outreach to engage all of the neighborhood. I found most of the times the people who had to do the most job in engaging were young people to make sure that they had a seat at the table. As you know, Boston is short on basketball courts, for example, compared to other cities our side. And so what we did at the Mary Hannon Park in Dudley Street was try to design a park that could be used by many different constituents at the same time, designing the basketball court in a place that was a little further from the benches and maybe the small gardens, and making sure that there was space for young people. There's a way to make sure that we can engage all Bostonians and have all their voices incorporated in park design.
Mr. Barrows, thank you. Councilor Wu, you have the floor.
Thank you. I apologize. This is the issue that comes up as we are out over the summer at different cookouts and basketball tournaments and spaces with our residents, where I hear constantly about a community that doesn't have access to the space for soccer fields with the programs that they're running, or communities where the only open spaces are further away and don't include more of the passive use type of urban wilds. And so we need to have a plan as a city that really ties together all of what makes for a vibrant neighborhood, and to elevate and center open space as a very important part of that. So as we are making important decisions as a community about the trade-offs between our housing and transportation and where schools go and how that's connected completely to access to open space across all different uses of that. And so I will make sure that the city of Boston is engaging in conversations with our residents, but doing so in a plan grounded in our long term.
Thank you very much. Question number 3, as you saw from the news this morning, is top of mind for a lot of voters. Development and open space, the challenge and the battle in that. While more housing is critically needed in Boston, development also brings threats to our current and potential green spaces. What creative strategies will your administration implement to balance development and the need for protected and public open space to accommodate a rapidly expanding population? Councilor Ivy-George, you're up first.
No, it's a great question, because oftentimes we do find development and the growth of our city in very direct conflict with open space, but it doesn't need to be so. We see that new residents to our city are attracted to the city because of its open space, and we need to continue to look for opportunities to create more, whether it's larger format open space that is actively designed, or passive parklets that are available for moments of respite and moments of sort of quiet here in the city. We also need to make sure that as we continue to develop and grow our city, that development is very much tuned into creating and creating opportunities for more of that open space, whether it is through parklet design or green space on a larger scale development, but also thinking about setbacks and creating opportunities for growing our tree canopy, because that is such an important part of what's sometimes missing across many of our neighborhoods when we look at East Boston or parts of Roxbury, or other parts of our city. Yeah, I'm
90 seconds, Counselor. So you have an extra 30.
90 seconds on that one. But we just have to be very mindful and thoughtful and think very deeply about the needs of our neighborhoods, and that development and growth reflects that. We also need to pay particular attention as we master plan so many of our neighborhoods. It's an effort that is happening across our city. And as we look to master planning, as we look to rezoning our city, that we are incorporating the necessary open space for that growth. It has to happen hand in hand and certainly in concert with one another.
Thank you very much. Counselor Wu, you're next.
Thank you. I think I was already starting to preview this with the answer to my last question, talking about the planning process. I've been proud in my role as the chair of the City Council's Committee on Planning, Development, and Transportation to ensure that the council has been a greater platform for oversight and for pushing for changes within this process so that we are looking to balance that long term. Boston is home. Boston is the place that invented the idea of free public parks open to all, free of barriers, and investing in the idea that we all deserve access to that open space. We know that that is a choice that each generation is making. How are we balancing the very important trade-offs when we grant development approvals to what we preserve as parks and open space for the next generation and the one after that, or what we use for very much needed affordable housing in this moment and for this generation and ones to come. And so as we are having these generational trade-offs, we need to make sure that our process matches the what's at stake. And that means, this is 90 seconds, okay. That means that we need to restructure this process bottom up. I put forward a very comprehensive plan for how we disentangle planning from the development agency, and how we would update our zoning code and go through a master planning process that brings together all of the different strands of what makes for vibrant communities. I've stood with parks groups in the case-by-case one-off bases where we've had to fight back to defend the garden and the common from encroachment. And I want to make sure that in all of our neighborhoods, we are continually growing and protecting those open spaces.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barrows. 90 seconds.
Thank you very much. When we think about past developments, when we think about what the federal government did with public housing, we know it's a mistake to do housing and not think about open space. We've learned this. We know that quality of life matters. It influences our ability to produce. It influences our ability to have good and strong relationships. It influences a lot of our outcomes in life. That's why the federal government changed its policy and how it builds to make sure, in fact, that there is a floor ratio to a building ratio in how it builds housing through the different public housing projects now through Hope 6 and other things. Boston needs to continue to do the same. The floor ratio needs to be one that we take very seriously in development, and making sure that we build open and green space for our residents. Make sure that we have tree canopy cover in the city of Boston. And we can do it through updating our planning process and our zoning codes for the city of Boston. We need to be more aggressive. We know that most of the trees that get cut in the city of Boston are cut down on private land, not public land. And so we need to make sure that then we can build on private land when people are building buildings by making sure that we have amount of tree or canopy coverage that we would like to see alongside physical buildings that are built in Boston. This is something that as mayor that I would prioritize. Apologize if I went over. I can't really tell the clock here.
No, you finished your thought with 5 seconds to go.
Thank you.
Councillor Campbell, you're up next. You have 90 seconds.
Thank you. I just want to, one, we have to prioritize it. And I'm just going to pick up on something Barrow said, which is around public housing when it wasn't prioritized. And now in the midst of COVID, of course, there's light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to COVID. But we're seeing from this public health crisis just how critically important it is to have access to green space, to have access to open space, what it does for your mental health, your spiritual health, your physical health. And so sometimes residents don't necessarily know the value that it brings until you don't have it. And so given where we sit, I think it's critically important that we lift up why it's so important that every neighborhood have access to parks, every neighborhood have access to open space, and maybe even run a campaign through the city of Boston expressing just how important it is to reducing rates of asthma, to closing health inequities in the city of Boston, to dealing with all of these issues through a public health lens. And there's a way in which, of course, once we set that intention to make sure that every single neighborhood has access to space. Of course, when it comes to development projects, critically important to make sure that these projects also include not only expansion of trees, but expansion of open space, parks. There's a way, of course, to do that by refining and reforming our zoning code, our planning process, et cetera. I'm really proud that my first piece of legislation on the council was a Community Preservation Act. We're using projects to do just that, expand open space. The Vacant Lot Initiative I started in the city of Boston. We're activating city-owned lots in communities that don't have access to green space. Intentionality is key in resources as well.
Thank you so much, Councillor. Question number 4 is on equity. Candidates, you have 90 seconds. In the questionnaires, you were asked what equity means with respect to parks. Your answers emphasize that equity is more than having access to a park within a short walk from home, but also includes attention to a wide range of issues: neighborhood involvement in planning, cultural competent programming, access to community gardens and to Boston's waterfront, attention to health disparities, and much more. In light of your vision for a more equitable Boston, what are some initial steps you would take with respect to our green spaces in helping to achieve that vision of greater equity? Councillor Wu, you're up first, and you have 90 seconds.
I'm very proud that one of the ideas I'm most excited about is already moving forward through investments that the city is making. And this is in the creation of what will be an urban conservation corps, workforce development program that will connect our young people and residents and community members with the chance to really get a foothold in the green economy, and to do so much of the restoration work, the creation of more open space, as well as retrofits of buildings and installation of solar panels, to do all of that we need to take on to transition into a climate just future. I'm also excited that the city of Boston is moving forward with a proposal to have an urban tree canopy plan, an urban forestry plan. And I will make sure as mayor that we are truly prioritizing our urban tree canopy place that is equitable across different neighborhoods, the foundation for health, well-being, and I was checking these 90 seconds, health, well-being, and mental health, in addition to the cooling effects that we've seen are so necessary, for example, in the middle of a heat wave right now. We also need to move forward with the creation of permanent open space for urban agriculture and community gardens as well. This is one of the most direct ways to support communities, to allow for economic opportunity to be connected to our open space, and we can have a plan to integrate all three of these.
Thank you. Mr. Barrows, you're next, and you have 90 seconds.
Thank you very much. I might just check in with you on the clock. I think, what I would do immediately is make sure that we tie the expansion of green space, of our green resources to our, resiliency plan. And be very intentional in making sure that we're aggressive and moving forward. In 2018, I remember when we announced a major coastal resilience program called the Resilient Boston Harbor. It called for 60 plus acres of new open space, more than 100 acres of revitalized open space on our waterfront. It is critical that we work with creative leaders in city government, in the private sector, to make sure that we move this work forward. In fact, I remember working in an interdepartmental effort to acquire 2 Water Street parcels in Rosendale so that we can expand the vital Rosendale wetlands urban wild. It's critical that we continue to do that work. Not all of that work is done on our waterfront, but there is a lot of it that's done on our waterfront. I'll make sure that we move forward on building the parks and the green space and the berm in the Fort Point Channel. There's co-benefits. We would have more parkland and at the same time would be protecting Boston from coastal flooding. These are the kinds of things that I would prioritize as Boston, because we can, in fact, increase green space and increase Boston's resilience, and we need to prioritize it.
Thank you, Mr. Barrows. Councillor Campbell, you are up next, and you have 90 seconds.
As we were just discussing, it's crystal clear, I think, to everyone on this Zoom who's been doing the work and to residents in the city of Boston, that there are stark disparities when it comes to access to parks, access to green space, especially in communities of color that are dealing with the brunt of environmental injustices and have been for generations, especially when it comes to the health disparities we're seeing, particularly in communities of color and low-income communities. And so everything I've done has always been through a racial equity lens. Even when I was council president, pushing the council as an institution to go through a training, a 6-month training, to also use a racial equity lens. And so that means intentionally investing in these neighborhoods that have been bearing the brunt of underinvestment for far too long. And that intentionality requires greater resources, greater human capital, greater planning efforts into being poured into these neighborhoods, which are largely Dorchester, Mattapan, Roxbury, Hyde Park, Eastie. It's usually the same neighborhoods that we flag in every report when we're talking about systemic inequity. So we have to make sure, of course, that the resources we're pouring in also respond to that inequity by making these communities whole. I speak to my accomplishment or record of accomplishment with the Community Preservation Act, the Vacant Lot Initiative, because I want folks to understand that I have a track record of delivering, even as a district councilor, when I didn't have a lot of resources available to me to close these gaps. So as mayor, I would absolutely use that same intentionality. I do also believe in creating more jobs. And that means, of course, making sure not only more jobs in communities of color, but also contracts for these projects also go to contractors of color and women and those in the LGBTQ+ community.
Thank you. Councillor Asaivi George, you are next, and you have 90 seconds.
Thank you. I believe that our city's parks and green spaces and other sort of creative and innovative open spaces are a critical part of the solution to dismantling systemic racism in our city and inequitable access to beautiful spaces. By investing in open spaces, we can mitigate the disproportionate impact of climate change on communities of color and improve the health disparities for our historically marginalized residents. And when it comes to open spaces, equity is about more than just being within a 10-minute distance from a park, which I think is such an important benchmark for us to ensure and make sure that we continue to meet. It's also about looking at neighborhoods that are most affected by climate change and looking very specifically at increasing tree canopies to improve air quality. It's also about looking at the areas that have been most rapidly redeveloped and creating spaces that maintain a certain quality of life for those who call those neighborhoods home. It's also about making sure that the condition of the parks and, whether it's Dorchester or Mattapan, are just as good as those in the Back Bay, parts of the South End and downtown. It's, equity is about being intentional and making sure that we are making sustainable investments in our city's parks and green spaces, and being very thoughtful and creative about new opportunities for open space. Most importantly, achieving equity requires acknowledging the decades of disinvestment that have happened across our city and making sure that we are focused on mitigating those immediately.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Question number 5 is on climate resilience. Candidates, you have 90 seconds. How will you build on the climate-ready Boston plans of the previous administration to increase Boston's climate resilience through green space infrastructure, and where will the funding come from? Mr. Barrows, you're up first.
Thank you very much. it's important that we continue to push on the administration's plan. They were done with community stakeholders. They're really good plans. But you're right. It's a really aggressive number, where we have more than $4 billion of projects that have been outlined in the 47 miles of waterfront, where we have a lot of buildings in the city of Boston to retrofit. We have to take advantage of the Biden administration's infrastructure bill, which is a historic bill, for us to come in and push our plan forward, for us to come in and make sure that we focus on areas and neighborhoods with the highest concentration of people at risk, with people of color, with immigrant communities, people with disabilities, seniors and low-income households, to make sure, in fact, that there is financing for them to retrofit their homes, to make sure, in fact, that we can help decrease the carbon footprint of our buildings in the city of Boston while improving people's lives. I want to then accelerate the renovation of our parks, particularly Moakley Park, which stands between the ocean and the neighborhoods that I'm talking about, which stands between the ocean and thousands of units of public housing in the city of Boston. We need to make sure that we are purposefully working with the federal government on funds, with the state government on funds, but then approaching a plan that is going to take care of those most in need and those who are most at risk. And as mayor, I will focus on that and do that.
Thank you, Mr. Barrows. Councillor Campbell, you are up next and you have 90 seconds.
First, we have a lot of great plans, and actually I invite every attendee on here to take a look at not only my climate plan, environmental plan, but also transportation. It's all connected on my website, because 90 seconds won't do it, andreacampbell.org. But one of the things I stress in that plan, and it's not too long, is the fact that the city of Boston does have a whole host of plans, but we've missed our own timelines, or we haven't been that inclusive. There are some plans or maps that don't even include my neighborhood of Mattapan. So talk about the lack of intersectionality in the environmental justice movement, the climate movement. So it's time for action. And I never like to think that we don't have enough resources. We do. And when you think about the magnitude of this crisis and the environmental injustices that have existed in the city of Boston for generations, there is money. There's money within our own budget that we could be investing more. There's money, of course, coming from the new federal administration. The new state bill just passed. There's state resources, the philanthropic community, the private sector. Everyone wants to step up. What they need is leadership, timelines, and accountability. And so for me, it's building upon those plans, implementing them now, making sure we're dealing with our own infrastructure in the city of Boston, in our own buildings, making sure that we're electrifying our fleet, our school bus fleet, dealing with our school buildings, making sure, of course, they have the HVAC systems and everything they would need to be green. Making it easier for landlords, and particularly those in low-income communities, to also modernize their homes, get solar panels for their homes, electric appliances, you name it. And then, of course, jobs for communities of color in particular, and contracts for those communities as well. A lot more within my plan. I hope folks will take a look.
Thank you. Councillor Asaibi George, you are next and you have 90 seconds.
So the impacts of climate change are a real threat here in Boston. That's for sure settled science. And while climate action is definitely about emissions and building greener buildings, it's also about environmental justice. We need to continue to be thoughtful and inclusive about planning processes that prioritize climate resiliency. And when we think about sea level rise, we tend to think about building concrete infrastructure, the buildings. But we have to be more thoughtful about how we elevate our city, our entire city, and build parks and playgrounds that help us mitigate the changes. And right now we have too much impermeable area, and there's just no place for the water to go. And we see the outcomes of that. Our climate actions must be on the frontline communities and in partnership with the frontline communities whose health and safety is most at risk. That means taking proactive steps, including our communities and our residents across the city. We need to mitigate how air pollution affects residents living under flight paths. I often talk about coaching softball in East Boston while looking at the ass end of airplanes all day long. That's not environmental justice. We need to protect our coastal neighborhoods. We need to improve public transit, and we need to grow our tree canopy. That too is settled science. And we need to make sure that for funding, we are leveraging partnerships on the state level, on the federal level, and together we need to come together and fund and invest in these projects that will make our city more resilient.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wu, you are next and you have 90 seconds.
Thank you. I've been really struggling the last couple days watching the coverage out of Miami, the images of that gut-wrenching building collapse, and so many visible symbols of lives lost in an instant, scores of lives gone because of such a clear failure of government in protecting and planning ahead, in inspecting, but also allowing in that macro way for that development to happen so close to the water without taking that into account of what happens when the salt water interacts with building foundations, et cetera. Climate is intimately connected with our decisions today. And the biggest point about funding is that the cost of inaction, the cost of ignoring climate change is far greater than what it takes to assemble the funding today to make those changes and to act in a collective, united way through a plan from the public sector. And so what do we do at the city level on such a big issue? One, I'm proud to have put forward the first city level Green New Deal anywhere in the country, 18 months worth of listening and learning from leaders at the local and national level, and that has earned the support of climate organizations and national leaders like Bill McKibben. The gist of this is that climate justice is racial and economic justice. Our resiliency is not only in starting now, making sure that we are no longer permitting buildings that will need to be immediately retrofitted to meet our climate goals, but that we are tying this to our futures and all the issues that are underlying the climate justice that we need in the city of Boston.
Thank you. Our sixth question is something you have all mentioned so far numerous times: urban forestry and trees. You get 60 seconds each, candidates. Boston has not increased the tree canopy despite research documenting the value of trees for a climate resilient city. In addition, there is an unequal heat island effect across neighborhoods. Although Boston has 180 acres of urban wilds, there are no maintenance staff for these critical spaces or for any of our park woodlands. Boston has initiated a $500,000 urban forestry plan, but what happens next? How will your leadership help us retain and grow our existing tree canopy cover? And how will you address neighborhood disparities? Councillor Campbell, you are up first and you have 60 seconds.
Thank you. And first of all, I appreciate the framing of all questions through an equity lens. I remember being at Franklin Field Public Housing, which is in my district. It's public housing that has not been renovated in 30 years. And a couple of bright spots is the park, Harambe Park, has gotten great investments, which is wonderful. Clearly, we have to renovate the housing itself. But it was also out there with our previous commissioner, Commissioner Cook, planting trees. And folks are like, what are you doing? I'm like, this is important for our health. This is going to help us reduce asthma. People were excited about that. So again, it goes back to that greater investment in using a racial equity lens and being intentional about it. If we can do it for sidewalks where people don't have to call the city to get their sidewalks prepared because we used a racial equity lens, we can do it for the tree canopy. It's about keeping our word. We've had plans over the years where we haven't kept to the timelines and accountability. We can do that. I think we need greater investment. I don't think $500,000 is enough, but it's about implementation and intentionality as well.
Thank you. Councillor Asaibi George, you are next in the lineup.
One of the most practical solutions to fighting environmental injustices, addressing public health, and tackling climate change is to plant more trees. It truly is that simple. And we all acknowledge that green space is not an amenity, it is a necessity. And we know that for all of our residents across the city of Boston. And it's certainly not just in our parks and in our open spaces, but when we think about the use of our sidewalks and on our median strips, between our streets and on city property, it's needs to be part of new developments that are approved before the city. We should be looking at every patch of greenery that our city has and look to offer an opportunity to grow that patch. We see the importance and the critical nature of our tree canopy, and we need to work to make sure that we are growing it certainly equitably across every single community. And we need to fund it. If it's part of our value statement, if it's part of what's important to us, we need to continue to fund it.
Thank you. Councillor Wu, you have 60 seconds.
We're so proud in Boston of being on the cutting edge of so many parts of our startup ecosystem and different technologies to solve problems. And for climate, I think it's been stated a couple times already, the most effective, innovative technology that we have, the most impactful to absorb emissions, bring heat down, all of what we've been discussing are what Mother Nature gave us, trees. And so I have a goal of reaching a near doubling of the number of street trees that we have in Boston, 30,000 trees by the end of the first term. This is a symbol of how quickly, how urgently, and the scale at which we need to act. Of course, I think as Chief Barrows had mentioned before, much of this is happening not on public property. You know, we can fill in the empty tree pits, but a lot of this is having conversations about development and private property. We also need to make sure that we are protecting the trees when it comes to major redevelopments. It took all of 9 years to fight losing almost 200 trees at Melnia Cass, and I'm proud to have been part of that effort in saving those trees, but many more that we need.
Thank you. Mr. Barrows, you are last on this question and you have 60 seconds.
Thank you very much. I'll build on, in fact, what Councilor Campbell talked about, Boston's equitable sidewalk program. When we started working on that, we looked at it, and there were some interesting conversations in the Walsh administration on how we did that. One of the things we looked at, in fact, was the cost of trees, right? And there is a real important conversation to be had about how we, in fact, increase our budget to plant trees with more canopy coverage. It's not all trees grow the same and cover the same. And so in Boston, we need to do the work that plants bigger trees. Now that means we need to increase staffing. It means we need to increase our maintenance budget, but it's something that we can do. Plant bigger canopy, trees with bigger canopy in our public spaces, in our public lands, whenever we are planting. But I think you framed it in the right way with the question. We actually need to also have more staffing for our forests, and we need to land bank private forest land in the city of Boston to make sure we can protect them.
Thank you, Mr. Barrows. Our next question is on community gardens. Candidates, you have 60 seconds. Community gardens not only help residents by providing food access, they beautify and help knit together communities. They build a culture of health across all age groups and promote cultural resilience. What specific actions do you propose to support community gardens and urban farms in our city? Councillor Asaibi George, you have 60 seconds.
In my role as a city councilor, I've had the opportunity to visit so many of our city's community gardens, and they are, as you say in the question and in the prompt, a true way to really engage our neighbors, not just in gardening. And when we think about the important role of food, when we think about the important role, the very important role of fresh food in for our residents, the more important, I think, outcome is this bringing of community together in spaces that are creatively used, sort of not that passive space, not the ball field or the soccer field, but the community garden. And it's about the flowers and it's about the vegetables, but it's also about that sense of neighbor to neighbor engagement. I've participated in a glass of wine and book talks at community gardens, and how special that is. We need to work to make sure that our community gardens have access to the resources to continue to bring people together and to support those community gardens year after year.
Thank you. Councillor Wu, you have 60 seconds.
Thank you. I am so excited about this piece of it. We see community gardens have been a mechanism for organizing, for empowerment, for democracy, along with all of the good that directly comes from the open space and the financial and economic independence that can come from producing your own food. So the City of Boston can truly help support the efforts that have already been growing in our community through a couple mechanisms. One is to set aside preference for community land trusts and create funding to directly fund the permanent affordability or commitment to designating open spaces as part of community gardens and these spaces. The second is we can model this with our own culture that we create on public land. I love the idea of having open orchards or fruit trees that are planted in public spaces that are open to everyone to collect, or having a seed library at our libraries for residents to access, promoting that culture of sharing and connecting.
Thank you, Councillor Wu. I see that Representative Santiago is here with us. Thank you for joining us tonight. You are next in the order, so I will repeat the question in case you didn't hear it. Community gardens not only help residents by providing food access, they beautify and help knit together communities, build a culture of health across all age groups, and promote cultural resilience. What specific actions do you propose to support community gardens and urban farms in the city? Representative, you have 60 seconds and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you and good evening, everyone. I apologize for being tardy at a very important meeting that was scheduled long before this event. So I apologize. I'm glad to be here partaking in yet another important forum with the community. And let me just say that I live right next to a community garden that has been very active in the midst of COVID, that has brought people together, that has allowed people to have an outlet in the midst of this pandemic, and that has provided for food for families in the midst of food insecurity. And so when I think about community gardens and the role that urban gardens play in Boston, I really look to the experts, to the residents, to the advocates, but particularly to the community land trust. I had a meeting with them about a month ago or so, and talk about the importance of their work in supporting these endeavors. And so I really want to focus my administration on supporting the work that community land trusts do, and by investing in a trust fund to establish them, and by replenishing that annually up to $5 million so they can invest in the types of work that they do, whether that's working on affordable housing issues or expanding community gardens. I think it's played such an important part in the community that I live in, and giving people an outlet to just be out there with the community, build community, again, address the food insecurity issue, but supporting community land trusts and making sure the city is prioritizing is something I'll do as the mayor of Boston.
Thank you so much, Representative Santiago. Since you weren't here earlier, I must note that you will find the timer clock on your screen, 60-second answers. Once it gets to 0, your time is up and you will be muted 10 seconds after that time is up. For 90-second answers, the timer will run twice, and at the second go round, it will stop at the 30-second mark. Mr. Barrows, you are up next.
Thank you very much. I agree with my colleagues. The Community Land Trust is a very important tool when we're thinking about urban farms. That's why at the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, after working with the BPDA to acquire more than 40 acres of land in our neighborhood to create urban farmland, to create affordable housing, parks, and open space, we then decided to build a 10,000 square feet greenhouse, because local food production matters, and doing it the right way, where we can actually populate our farmers markets with locally grown food, is critical. It's important, but we also need to make sure that we are providing technical assistance and not just land and protection of land, because so much of our soil is not healthy. And we've got to make sure that we can help people have, soil that's clean, and that we can help them plant either, sunflowers or other crops to continue to turn it over and make sure that it has the right nutrients. It's important that we also work with our young people on our urban farms so that they understand where food comes from and how important it is to take care of our land.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barrows. Councillor Campbell, you have 60 seconds.
Thank you, and thank you for this question. I have a few in my current district, and I know as I engage with more residents across the city, this is near and dear, because like you said in the question, this is a tool to address issues of food insecurity, to make it easier for folks in certain communities to have access to healthy, affordable, sometimes free food. I'm a member of the Dorchester Food Co-op in Dorchester. They use a local farm in the community, an urban space, I should say, in the community, and community garden, I should say, and it's amazing. And it does bring people together. So there are a few things the city of Boston can do to make it easier. One, with respect to our own city-owned land, there are hundreds of vacant lots. Give those lots away, I often say to Chief Dillon and others, for purposes just as this. Provide the resources, and that means monetarily funding some of these initiatives. Also, technical assistance, critically important. The third piece is community land trusts. Yes, greater investments, especially with the federal dollars that are coming in, we can invest more. But food co-ops and co-op models are also critically important. New York City is far ahead of us in terms of technical assistance and resources. We need to catch up with that model as well, which provides jobs and ownership in community.
Councillor Campbell, thank you. Our next question is on the Parks Department budget. Candidates, you have 60 seconds. COVID has shown us how important parks are and exponentially increased park use all year round. For years, park advocates have been pressing for more funding for park maintenance and programs in the operating budget of the Boston Parks Department. Currently, less than 1%, just 0.75% of the city's operating budget, our tax dollars, goes to the Boston Parks Department for their operating cost, which cover maintenance, programs, and project management. Will you commit to 1% of the city's operating budget for BPRD operations? Please answer yes or no. And where would your priority be for the additional funding? Representative Santiago, you have the floor. You have 60 seconds.
The short answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, we have seen what incredible roles parks have played throughout this pandemic. You know, there are places people have gone to build community, to take a break, and to exercise. And we know that healthier communities and urban living brings, fosters that type of cohesion that we need in this community more than ever. So the answer is yes. In terms of the funding, we're going to have hundreds of millions of dollars coming to the city. So I don't think it's going to be an issue of funding. We have 400 million coming to the schools. We had almost 600 million coming to the city of Boston. So I think there will be funding. What we need is political will, and I'll bring that as the mayor of Boston.
Councillor Wu, you are up next, and you have 60 seconds.
Thank you very much. I commit to significantly increasing and growing the resources that are flowing to our open spaces across the city. But rather than saying we're going to pick a certain number in the absent the context of the full budget, I think it's important to emphasize the outcomes that we will get and the interconnectedness of how our approach to parks and open space has to be woven in with every other department, whether that is schools and ensuring there are living outdoor classrooms and spaces for every single school, or whether that's connected to housing and how we think about public housing and our sidewalks in the transportation department and street trees. And so rather than saying we're going to check a box, right, I am sure that if we take the right approach, if we truly elevate and center parks and open space, we will get to that number and beyond. But this is not about hitting a certain number of dollars. We have federal funding coming down, but we need to find a sustainable, ongoing source. So of course, let's use the resources in this historic moment, but let's really dig in and ensure we're having this conversation in a holistic way.
Thank you. Mr. Barrows, you have 60 seconds.
Thank you. The answer is yes. There are all types of benefits that come from investing in our green space. In fact, I think there was a study done, an economic development impact study on green space that showed that the closer you are to a quality green space, the more benefit you have in your real estate values. In fact, it was shown at 2.5% growth over time because of that, faster than real estate next to you. That's a case that I made when the administration brought up CPA very early on. We pushed for CPA and made sure, in fact, that people understand that real estate was gaining because of quality parks. As mayor, I will continue to make that case. In fact, as chief of economic development, when we sold Winthrop Square, I was one of those advocating that most of the money go to our parks. In fact, $28 million went to improve Boston Commons. Another $28 million went to improve Franklin Park. It was a historic investment. And as mayor, I'll make sure that we continue to make historic investments in our parks.
Mr. Barrows, thank you. Councillor Campbell, you have the floor and you have 60 seconds.
The short answer is yes. And there are a whole host of ways in which we need to be investing additional dollars. Of course, it is in creating an employee base, whether it's also within City of Boston, expanding City of Boston employees, but also working in partnership with our incredible residents who volunteer their time to ensure that we can continue to maintain our parks. They're in open spaces. There are so many communities that often complain that they don't get the maintenance that they need. Our schools. I can't receive another email with pictures from our young people and from families and parents where children don't have access to a great schoolyard, where they have cement as their play yard, which is ridiculous when you think about all the resources in the city of Boston. Boston Housing Authority, this is where usually no income, forget low income, no income residents live. We need to make sure that everyone in these spaces have access to green space and really looking at the inequities in terms of access. And then lastly, just parks in general, really looking at the fact that there are certain parts of the city of Boston. I often say none of us should accept this. Certain parts of the city of Boston where there are park deserts. That's ridiculous. And we can absolutely change that with greater investment in the city of Boston's budget.
Thank you. Councillor Asaibi George, you are up next and you have 60 seconds.
So colleagues will appreciate the yes. Second time I've used that in a form that I haven't been asked to today. But I also want to know, fellow candidates will appreciate that my house is actually kind of quiet this evening. And that's because my boys are off using our parks. And in fact, for a little bit, one of the boys who's not at baseball this evening took Astro the dog for a walk to our local park. And that's why he's especially quiet this evening. Our parks play a tremendous role in benefiting our residents across the city, young and old and four-legged alike. And I truly do believe in their benefit beyond just that active space and mental health and access to fresh air and access to open space and the ability to exercise. So supporting increasing the parks budget is something that's important to me and will certainly be a priority in the Asaibi George administration. And we can leverage the ongoing building boom here in the city of Boston. The city will continue to grow. We need to leverage those opportunities to help invest in a growing open space and active park space in our city.
Thank you, Councillor. Our next question is on cross-jurisdictional issues. Candidates, you have 60 seconds. More than half of the city's parkland and park spending in Boston is under the control of the state through the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation and other agencies. How will your administration collaborate with state park agencies to support your goals for Boston parks and green spaces? Councillor Wu, you're up first and you have 60 seconds.
Just today, actually, I was out at Franklin Park, yesterday, out at Franklin Park with the Emerald Necklace Conservancy and standing in front of the Shattuck site, looking at a key decision point for the city of Boston and for the state, which right now the city has not been driving. We are talking about city-owned land that was leased over to the state for a major decision in which we have not had the chance to engage community members in a way that is tied to the long-term vision across all of the parcels in the area. And so for me, the city has to step into the role of driving a proactive vision. When we are leading the conversation, we can coordinate with the state about how all the different parcels of land fit together. We are a city where more than 50% of our land mass is nonprofit, is exempt from property taxes. A big portion of that is from the state. And so as our collaborators and as our neighbors, sometimes we need to be a little tough and ensure that we are driving this conversation, not sitting back and waiting.
Thank you. Mr. Barrows, you are up next. 60 seconds.
Thank you very much. It's critical. It's critical that the next mayor continue to have a good relationship with the state. As part of the Walsh administration, we had that, and we were effective. In fact, we're working with different state agencies, with the different partners that we need to bring Boston the quality and open space that we deserve. One of those efforts I led in the Nubian Square area, where we worked with DCR to put together a development parcel that actually preserved open space, preserved historic space right there on Harrison Ave and Melanie Cass, right next to the non-factory. In fact, we had to make sure that there were all types of legislation that was adhered to, and that we were able to have not only the resources to make sure that the historic nature of that site was preserved, but that we would always have open space, public space, and access no matter what development went on that site. That's the kind of leadership and experience I bring to this, and that's the kind of work that I will do with DCR and the state as mayor.
Mr. Barrows, thank you. Councillor Campbell, you are up next and you have 60 seconds.
Working with the state is going to be critical on every issue, especially when making sure we have the human resources we need to address the issues to come in the city of Boston, not just, of course, with respect to parks, but all the other challenges that lie ahead. I actually worked in state government. I worked as an attorney for Governor Deval Patrick, worked with and in partnership with the state legislature to get things done. I've continued to use those relationships to get things done in my district. Really proud that one of the vacant lots in one of my communities, we work with the state, DCR, it's near the Fairmont line, and the Trust for Public Land to create green space in this community. Would continue that level of partnership to get things done if I'm blessed to become the next elected mayor. I will tell you though, out of all the agencies I've worked with, and I've worked with the MBTA, DCF, many, DCR is really difficult to work with. I find myself and my team calling and calling frequently. So I do think there sometimes needs to be a tougher conversation to say there might be a leadership change that's needed at a particular agency, or a real deep conversation around how we build better working relationships, because residents have found it really difficult to get things done with DCR, but we can change that as a collective, and if we sometimes are willing to have the tough conversation.
Thank you. Councillor Saibi George, you are next. You have 60 seconds.
So it's really important across lots of different sectors, certainly our parks, our open spaces, that we have a very positive and productive relationship with our partners at the state level. It's also important thinking about some of the land here and the open space here in the city of Boston, that we have an equally close relationship with our federal partners. We think about the role of the national parks here in our city. We think about the role of the Harbor Islands as resources and assets and places where our residents should certainly enjoy. We also have to think about our relationship with our nonprofit partners, some of our institutions and our cultural centers that have a large areas of open space in which our city's residents should also have opportunities to engage. I've committed as a candidate for mayor and continuation of my work on the city council to reconvene the pilot task force. And we think about those institutional partners. We have to think and also realize the assets they have in their open space and how our city's residents should also have opportunities to utilize them.
Thank you so much. Representative Santiago, you are next. You have 60 seconds.
Thank you. This is an incredibly important question, because I think sometimes people don't understand how much property DCR has in the city of Boston. This is something that I became very much aware of as a state representative and have been active on. You know, we have the Southwest Corridor Park in my district, so where I jog and where I take walks. And over the course of the past couple of years, things have changed. You know, we've had a mass and cast issue with opioids and homelessness that has been shown and it's gone up there. We have a situation where the lighting was out just recently. So I've been very much on the front lines doing the work, organizing not just folks from the city, but from the state and from the community to get things done. We put new lighting up. We addressed what was going on with respect to homelessness and opioid issues. We moved forward, but we did it in partnership. We did it by understanding, who is doing what and when and who has the responsibility. And I think coming from the state and having those relationships and by getting things done, I'm looking forward to leading those conversations as the next mayor of Boston. But we did it on the Southwest Corridor Park with much fanfare, with community very much engaged. And as the only candidate in this race from Beacon Hill who has worked with DCR in a very real way, I'm looking forward to leading that charge as the next mayor of Boston.
Thank you very much, Representative Santiago. I must note, we have over 300 people who registered to watch this virtual forum. So while you are enjoying, to our attendees who are watching, please feel free to share on social media what you've learned. You can link to this conversation by using the hashtag Boston Park Forum. And because we are a bit ahead of time, you guys are pretty good at being concise, you get 2 minutes for your closing statement, which will be our closing question. You get 2 minutes, and this is the question. What will your first 100 days look like for parks and open space? What will you do first for Boston's green space. Convince our audience that you will be Boston's green space mayor. Mr. Barrows, you are up first.
Well, first, since it's my closing statement, is this my closing statement? Is that right? 2 minutes?
Yes, this will be the closing statement.
Well, then let me just start with thank you. I want to thank all of you, organizing members of the groups that have come together to put this forum together, and great facilitation. Thank you very much for both clear questions and well-phrased questions and helping us through the timing. You know, the first 100 days will be important for us to establish our priorities. And for me, parks and open space is a priority. Right now, my kids are enjoying the fabulous Mass Audubon camp at the Boston Nature Center, learning about the outdoor space, learning about how to be hands-on, learning about science education. It is important that we continue to provide that to our children, that you know, those maybe who aren't going to the Boston Nature Center for the summer, that they can get it at school, that green space is a part of what people can enjoy in Boston. Right now, we have 10-minute walk to green space in Boston. I am committed to making sure that every resident in Boston has 5 minutes to a quality space in their neighborhood. It's something that I've enjoyed. It's something that my children enjoyed, but it's also something that I know is important to our neighborhoods, to our public health, and to us being a more resilient city. As executive director of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, I led an effort to make sure that we acquire every empty lot we could possibly acquire and turn them into parks, open space, urban farmland. We partnered with other community partners to create a holistic, sustainable food and gardening landscape for residents throughout the neighborhood. It's important that we continue to do that as our city and do that for every resident to make sure that everybody has equitable access to open space and everybody is protected by our urban forests. Everybody is protected by the tree canopies that we should be providing for our city. I've demonstrated that commitment as Chief of Economic Development with historic investments into Boston Common and Franklin Park, and I will continue to do that as mayor.
Mr. Barrows, thank you. Councillor Campbell, you have the floor and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you for moderating. And of course, thank you to all of the advocates for creating this space for us to talk about these critical issues. I jumped into this race back in September because I was speaking to the fact that while we are a world-class, international, incredible city, a city I deeply love, that we are still a city that has persistent inequities. And it's no different when you look at access to green space, to parks, to open space. And obviously in the midst of COVID-19, we are recognizing just how critically important it is to our health that every family, every community have access to all of these spaces. And this is our moment in time to address those inequities. And so my leadership as a district councilor representing District 4 for the last 6 years has always been about justice, has always been about closing these inequities, because for me, this work is indeed personal. I've experienced what it means when this city does not work for everyone. And I've also experienced and seen the possibilities. Growing up poor here, even though we lived in public housing, we still had access to great parks growing up in Roxbury in the South End. So we can make sure that every single family in this city has access to the same opportunities I had growing up here. In my first 100 days, I would do a few things. One is immediately expand the parks budget. We've been talking about it for a really long time. Absolutely more investment in our tree division. Good luck trying to get a tree looked at. It takes about 6 months or longer. That is also ridiculous when you think about the caseload and the constituent cases we get with respect to trees and other issues in the city of Boston. Just expanding the human capital in that department for us to respond. Completing that audit so we have a sense of which communities are lacking parks, and then immediately investing in either city-owned lots or working with private owners to activate spaces for these parks. In addition, I would make sure that everything we do is through a public health lens and a racial equity lens. And when we do that, we will know that whether it's development or whether it's looking at what communities need, it should always be on the table that they need open space for our young people, and that there should be a myriad of uses available. If you want to learn more about my candidacy, please visit andreacampbell.org, and I hope to earn your support in this race. Thank you, and stay cool and hydrated.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Asaibi George, you are up next, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk about our parks and our green space and our open space, because we know that our parks and green space and open space do so much for our city and our city's residents. We know that some of our residents use them as an oasis from the buildings and the concrete, and that they are a significant relief from some of the challenges of living in concrete buildings, especially over this last year. And I think often about the mental health benefits of being near a park and being able to enjoy open space. We know that some of our residents use them to engage with their community, especially through those community gardens that we talked earlier this evening about. And we also know many of our city's residents use them, our parks and open space, for active play, or to run and play sports, and to have a local festival or a gathering or a community party. And sometimes we use those spaces to walk our dogs, and how important it is that we have these opportunities and continue to have these opportunities. Parks personally have done a lot for me. It's where I played soccer as a kid, where I learned to play softball, where I climb the stairs today for a little bit of exercise when I think about the stadium at Oakley Park. It's where I coached when I was coaching softball at East Boston High School at the City Yards in East Boston. And it's where I watch my boys play baseball and soccer and football today. And certainly in my first 100 days as mayor, I look forward to catching my boys playing football this fall in the appropriate season, as opposed to the spring season. In my first 100 days as mayor, I will take a hard look at all of our parks and open spaces, our green spaces across our city, to ensure that we are approaching this work with an equity lens, and that we are fulfilling our promise for all of our residents to be within a 10-minute walk to a park. We will be very intentional through my administration in making investments that will boost that accessibility. And we will do this work in partnership with community. I look forward to serving as your mayor and hope to have your support and your partnership in this work going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Representative Santiago, you are up next, and you have 2 minutes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to partake in this forum. And thank you to the park advocates for convening us all tonight. And again, I apologize for showing up late as a result of a pre-scheduled meeting. Thank you for the work you do. It's extremely valuable, and too often it goes underappreciated. The role that parks have played in my life has been extraordinary. I can recall my first memories of growing up in Roxbury, walking to Franklin Park, where I threw my first pitch, climbed my first tree. They played a fundamental role in my life. And I'm so honored that I've been able to partner with some of the advocates, probably on this very phone call right now, on a whole host of green initiatives over my years in government and those preceding government, whether it was working with advocates to help save trees on the cast, whether it was partnering with the Charles Gate Alliance to really restore Olmsted's vision, or in my work, as a park advocate, still cleaning parks in my neighborhood, whether that's Titus Sparrow Park in the South End, or that's Blackstone. I'm still out there picking up trash and working with park advocates to make sure that our public green space is best taken care of. So as mayor, I want to let you know that you will have the full backing of my office to continue all the important work that you do. And that starts, number one, by my commitment to the budget. Budgets are value statements, and I value parks and green space. And more than that, I want to make sure that all families, can have a park to go to from all backgrounds. That is the promise of Boston, and we have to make sure that we include social justice when we talk about planning, when we talk about parks and the availability to green space. But secondly, I'm sure it was asked earlier, it sounds like there was a tree question. To me, I have, I care about the tree canopy in our city, the fact that we are nowhere where we need to be right now. I think Menino, when he was the mayor, he wanted to get to 100,000 trees by 2020. Mayor Walsh, I believe, extended that to 2030. We have a lot of work to do. And so as we plan to continue and complete this inventory, let's make sure to really to understand that those trees, those first year trees, are at risk. And so putting forth a program to identify those trees most at risk is something I'm committed to doing, to making sure that our tree canopy can be as resilient as ever. So I'm honored to partake in this debate today. Thank you for the time, and I look forward to hopefully earning your vote on September 14th.
Thank you very much, Representative Santiago. Councillor Wu, you are last but not least, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna Didus, and thank you so much to all of the host organizations and everyone who's taken the time to be here. Of course, my fellow candidates, we got to open the day together and now end the day together with candidate forums. I'm so excited at the opportunities and the energy in Boston to truly seize this moment, to transform the structures and the systems that we have in the city, and
to chart a path towards the future that we deserve, the city that we've been dreaming of. In my first 100 days, I'll make sure that we are building the structural connections between community and government to truly define what that bold, aspirational, doable vision is of Boston. We will be convening all of the organizations that represent and touch on parks and open space and climate. We will be setting together those moonshot goals about what does it look like for our tree canopy? What do the intersectional goals look like between schools and open space, between housing and our parks, between transportation and our parks? And we'll make sure that we are putting the leadership in the right roles to be able to follow through on that, with staffing, with funding, with the capacity to make sure that we are actually doing so much of what we've been talking about year after year after year. For me, this is deeply personal. More than anything else, I'm a mom, and every policy issue, I guarantee you, the first way that I'm looking at that policy issue is through the lens of how does this affect families, particularly families with kids all across our city. Our parks have been a godsend for my family. My boys have been in just about every single one of them, waiting for me at events or at events in Boston. And I want to make sure that all of that is accessible to all of our residents, not only for you to be able to have that very short walk to the park in your neighborhood that you love and is part of your routines and you treasure, but that you know what's available all across the city, that we've made that accessible online and through other information and special events, so that we are also connecting each park, each jewel as part of a larger destination for everyone to access.
Thank you very much, Councillor Wu. That concludes our program for this evening. Thank you so much to the candidates who took the time to be with us today. I also want to applaud the Boston Park Advocates, a network of park-connected groups from across the city who devote their volunteer time and energy to making Boston's green infrastructure the best it can be. Please make sure to visit their website, bostonparkadvocates.org, to learn more about the candidates, the election, and park advocacy opportunities. It has been an honor and a delight to be with all of you this evening. Best wishes for a safe and restful night.
Night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yep. And we will show the PowerPoint for a second as people are leaving. And thank you so much.